Special speaker series program that we didn't originally have scheduled, but through the hard work of Senator Calcase, we have pulled together a program that I think you're going to really enjoy. Lester Hunt is one of the, unfortunately, forgotten figures in Lander history and in Wyoming history to a large degree, so hopefully we're going to rectify that to a degree at least tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Cale and Roger McDaniel here in a moment, but I do want to talk about a couple of other things coming up at the museum. We are kicking off another very, very busy year. We have a whole series of other speakers. There's a little flyer here in the back if you want to know about that. That also lists our treks, where we go to various historic sites around the county, and our children's programs, which are throughout the year. Our next speaker is actually next Monday, June 3rd, and it's another Lander son. Some of you might remember Alan Ohashi, who spent a lot of time here in Lander. He's a filmmaker down in Boulder now, and he has put together a really interesting project called the Arapaho Covered Wagon. And many, many years ago, there was a silent movie called Covered Wagon, which was filmed in this area. And Alan got together with the Arapaho tribe and has rescored it with native music, which I think is going to be a really interesting experience. So we're going to see the movie. It'll be here in the livery as well. We're going to see the movie, and the actual drumming group will be here performing as well. So it should be a really interesting program next Monday, June 3rd at 7 p.m. So all of this stuff's in the back. Take it and certainly check our social media or give us a call or stop by, and we'll let you know what all is going on at the museum. And again, thank you all for coming, and I'm going to hand the mic to Senator Calcase.
Thank you so much, Randy, and it's good to see everybody here. This is a really powerful story that we're going to learn about tonight. It is so gigantic, and today Roger didn't do the end of the story, so I'm going to maybe talk a little bit about the end of the story. And so you can maybe understand how big this was in our country. So Lester Hunt, he announced he wasn't running for re-election on June 8th. June 9th was the day when that famous Joe McCarty Army hearing was held. It was actually a continuation of the hearing. But it's the one where the civilian attorney turned on Senator McCarthy and said, "Have you no decency, sir?" And some of you have seen that clip. It was actually televised, one of the earliest. Have you no decency? And there's a backstory between that, but McCarthy was way out of line and the guy called him out of it, and the nation heard it. That was the 9th of June. On the 18th of June, Senator McCarthy had a press conference and announced that he had some dirt on a particular Democratic senator. We think that was our senator. On June 19th, Lester Hunt took his own life in his office building, in his office. It's the Russell office building now, but it didn't have that name back then. He didn't die till that afternoon in a hospital. On Monday morning, both houses of the United States Congress met. Chaplains offered prayers. I have copies of those prayers. And they passed courtesy resolutions designating who would attend the funeral. And they had 16 senators, including the Vice President of the United States, who was head of the Senate. And they had 5 members of the House. And the piece that's lost in this sometimes is on that day, June 8th, when our Senator Lester Hunt announced his resignation, or he announced he wasn't going to run for re-election, the U.S. Senate had 48 Democrats, 47 Republicans, and 1 independent. It was that tight, and it was that serious. And the Republicans would do anything to get control of the Senate. Both houses of Congress adjourned after passing those courtesy resolutions. Hunt's body was put on a U.S. Air Force plane. The Air Force was around by then. And the group of dignitaries boarded another Air Force transport. They arrived in Cheyenne that evening. Hunt's body was placed in state at the Wyoming state capitol, and all the state offices clear across the state were closed. People lined up to file past the coffin. Many state employees came because he had had such an illustrious career with the state, and people knew him and loved him. When they took his body from the Capitol and took it down to St. Mark's Episcopal Church for the service, as they were bringing him into service, 8 Air Force jets flew over Cheyenne in 1954. People hadn't even seen jets. 8 jets flew over. The service was short. When it was concluded, they got in a cortege to take to the cemetery, Bethel Cemetery. They say that thousands of people lined the streets as the funeral procession passed. And he's buried there in Bethel Cemetery. And then we forgot about him. We forgot about him because of the suicide. We forgot about him because of the very, very divided country. We forgot about him because of homosexuality and the implications of his son. But we forgot about him. But this is the time when it's relevant to think about him. First off, suicide in Wyoming, worst in the country sometimes, very close to the worst right now. We have a terrible problem with suicide. And for anyone that's listening on podcasts or thinking, we want you to live, and we understand that talking about suicide is difficult, and we want you to know that Wyoming has resources for you, confidential resources. Call 988, and please, we want you to live. Talk to someone in Wyoming. It's going to be okay. Imagine a Senate that divided, everyone. It's akin to what we have right now. The politics are just as ugly. Sometimes the speeches and the bombastedness, that's not even a word, but the bombastic actions of people that don't really care about the people they're hurting in politics. And so this came up as the 70th anniversary, and it's so important that we do this. It'll be healing for Lander, it's healing for Wyoming, and it's going to be healing for our country. I have hopes the U.S. Senate is going to commemorate this event somehow. I'm working on that, talked to John Barrasso yesterday. There is going to be a healing service in Cheyenne on the day of the suicide, and the governor's going to issue a proclamation and read the proclamation at that service. So Lester Hunt was a good man, overwhelmingly caught up in tragic times and a victim, but he stood up more than anyone. You look at his writings and the things he did, he stood up about what was happening and tried to make the times better. And there's another man here tonight who stood up and is trying to make things better, and that's Roger McDaniel. And Roger, I had to tell him today when I first met him, because I first met him in 1982. And it was at a campaign event where he was running for U.S. Senate in 1982, can you imagine? And Roger served in the legislature. He must be one of the youngest ever, because he was 21 when he was first elected. He served for 10 years. And then while he was in the legislature, toward the end, he went to law school. He became a lawyer. Later in his life, he worked, he worked for Tino Roncalio for 8 years. And and then he served the state of Wyoming. He's been a lobbyist, but he served as an administrator in the Department of Health and the Department of Family Services. He's a really special man. He's a minister, and he and his wife do so much volunteer work on all sorts of things. But he's a scholar, and he's here tonight. And let me introduce to you Roger McDaniel.
You did. Thank you. Thank you. After an introduction like that, Tino used to say, "I only wish my parents could have been here to hear that. My dad would have loved it and my mother would have believed it." But thank you. Thanks to the Pioneer Museum and Randy for hosting this event, and for Cale for organizing it, and Sean Reese and Wyoming Humanities, who are here tonight to live stream the evening, and for this audience at the museum who has taken time to come out tonight to remember an extraordinary person who contributed so much to the state of Wyoming, one of Lander's favorite sons, Lester Hunt. He came here in the early years of the 20th century just to play baseball. He was an outstanding baseball player, born in southern Illinois, grew up there. The word spread far and wide about this incredible baseball talent. And in those days, in this part of Wyoming, baseball was huge. Every one of these communities in Fremont County and the Bighorn Basin had baseball teams. And Lander had a particularly good team. Their two top pitchers were called to the major leagues by the Chicago White Sox. And when they left, there was no joy in Mudville because they didn't have a pitcher. But somehow they learned about this kid, Lester Hunt. And they went out to Illinois and recruited him, and he said he'd come to Lander to play baseball if they also brought along his friend Muggs, who was his catcher. And so he and Muggs took the train and ended up in Lander and loved it from the very beginning. He built a life here. He was interrupted in that by World War I when he served. He met Nathel here and married her, raised a family and a daughter, Elise. He went to dental school and practiced dentist here for some years. Great anecdotes in the book about his internship under a dentist here named Dr. Richards. They would get into a horse-drawn wagon and go up into the mountains in the rural areas where nobody could access dental care. And they would go ranch to ranch and farm to farm and find people who needed dental care. And there's one sort of gripping story, if you will, about a ranch hand who had a badly impacted tooth. And Dr. Richards and Lester Hunt took turns trying to pull that tooth out of this fellow's mouth. And Lester said, "We never got it out." But I read it imagining the pain that all three of them experienced trying to do that. But it was his sacrifice for his son Buddy that opened a door for politics. His son Buddy had a condition that required transplants, bone grafts. And the bone had to come from Lester Hunt. And there were several tries at it before it worked. But it left Lester Hunt unable to stand for extended periods of time, and so he could no longer practice dentistry. So in 1932, he ran for the legislature. A Democrat in an overwhelmingly Republican community. And I note in the book that, if you win a seat in the legislature in a large urban area, it's because people know your name. If you win a seat in the legislature in a small rural community, it's because they know you. And they had come to know Lester Hunt and respected him and loved him, and they elected him to the legislature in 1932. Thanks to events like this, people may remember him not only for his tragic death, but for his integrity, his courage, his devotion to his family and this community, and his exemplary work as a public servant. Today is an opportunity to talk about his place in Wyoming and U.S. history. And it's also a chance, as Cale indicated, to think about the lessons that can be learned from his death and connect them to an issue of singular importance in Wyoming. The fact that our state often leads the nation in the numbers of our fellow citizens who volunteer to take their own lives. Interestingly, whether it be the high suicide rate or the polarized political environment, there is a connection. There is a nexus in the choices we make about how we will relate to one another and whether we choose to have healthy personal relationships or choose to be increasingly divided and polarized and isolated from one another. During the French Revolution, people who were condemned to beheading were forbidden by law from committing suicide under penalty of the confiscation of their estate. Because, as suicide historian Georges Menoir explains, anyone sentenced to death who killed himself was depriving the authorities of an opportunity to exercise their authority. And though Hunt's suicide was a predictable consequence of the behavior of those 3 senators who blackmailed him, those who wished, metaphorically, to behead Hunt, they probably never considered that a politician like that might volunteer to end his own life, thus depriving them of the opportunity to use their political power. Lester Hunt died when I was 6 years old, so obviously I never met him. I did get to know his son, Lester Hunt Jr., whom they called Buddy, while writing his father's biography. One day, out of the blue, I received a Facebook friend request from Lester Hunt Jr. I have written a column for the Cheyenne and Laramie papers for 13 years, and a mutual friend, had shared my columns with Buddy, and he wanted to talk to me. So we visited, and during the course of our conversation, I said, somebody ought to write your father's biography. And he said, well, why don't you do that? And so I went out to Chicago and spent a week with him and listened to his story. Remarkable human being. By the time I met him, he was in his early 80s, quite spry and in good health. After this incident, his father's suicide, he went to Cuba, where he spent a couple of years in the mountain villages teaching literacy courses to poor campesinos. He then returned and moved to Chicago, where he worked with a fellow named Saul Alinsky. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Saul Alinsky, but he was a liberal organizer in the poor communities in Chicago. And in his autobiography, he credits Lester Hunt with all of the success they had in voter drives, in health clinics, in education, and other efforts to help the Hispanic community in Chicago. So he was a pretty extraordinary guy. He later married, had 2 daughters and grandchildren, but he was haunted for many, many years about his father's death, carrying the guilt, believing for almost 6 decades that he was the cause, unaware that politics was at the root of the tragedy. But he spent years, he told me, when I asked him how he had dealt with his father's suicide, he said it was years of psychological therapy and studying the causes of suicide. He referred me to the works of Émile Durkheim, a French sociologist in the 19th century who is credited with establishing the academic discipline of sociology, and he was the principal architect of modern social science. Much of Durkheim's work was concerned with questions about how a society can maintain its integrity and coherence in times of change. He wrote extensively about the role of social norms in self-harm. His work opened an understanding of suicide based on science and research rather than ancient prejudices and religious notions. Durkheim believed societal relationships and cultural forces had more influence on the decision to take one's life than an individual's personal inclinations. Durkheim believed suicide was frequently a response to things gone wrong in the broader culture. and that explains Senator Hunt's suicide. It also explains the high rate of suicide among farmers during hard economic times, among combat veterans, addicts, and the elderly. It explains the high rate of suicide and suicide ideation among LGBTQ kids who are rejected by families and communities, bullied by classmates while listening to politicians debate their existence. For LGBTQ kids, there's something wrong in the broader culture that causes them to be targeted, threatened, harmed, bullied, and discriminated against. Transgender people are tormented by a political culture debating their very dignity. Last year, there were more than 500 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in legislatures across the country. And the debate over those bills has been found to have a serious negative impact on young people. 90% of their well-being, they say, was negatively affected by recent politics, according to a Trevor Project poll. The rate of suicide ideation in the trans community is 55%, and 29% actually attempt suicide, and too many of them succeed. Durkheim, like many of us, will not be surprised to learn that a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association recently found that abortion restrictions play a role in the suicides among younger women. And regardless of which side you are on those issues, it's not difficult to understand why those who are trans or LGBTQ or feel that they need to exercise their right to an abortion, it's not hard to understand that those people are cast into a period of time in their life of enormous stress. And there's little surprise, I think, that some of them resort to self-harm. Those numbers tell us Durkheim was right. Suicide is not, as some of my clergy colleagues say, part of God's plan, or as others say, a sign of personal weakness. It's connected to the failures and pressures of the larger society. Suicide prevention is about more than funding a hotline and mental health services. And as important and critical as those things are, we all must work to fix the broken parts of our culture as well. But Durkheim gives us a context in which we can understand Senator Hunt's decision. Senator Lester C. Hunt was, quote, truly emblematic of all that is good in America. How do we know that? Idaho Senator Herman Welker, one of the men who blackmailed him, causing the suicide, said so during a service held in the U.S. Senate to memorialize Hunt. Hunt demonstrated the best qualities that, quote, could characterize any American. Those words spoken at the same memorial service by Senator Stiles Bridges of New Hampshire to cover up his evil deeds and participation in the cruelty that drove Lester Hunt to take his own life. Senator Al Simpson wrote the foreword for my book called Dying for Joe McCarthy's Sins. And I want to read just a piece of what Al Simpson wrote. He says, the 1954 campaign for the United States Senate in Wyoming went beyond anything even the toughest, meanest, most negative politician would have recognized as acceptable. What was done to Lester Hunt passed all boundaries of decency and exposed an evil side of politics most would seek to avoid. Lester Hunt was a decent man who spent 27 years of his life in public service. He understood the arena could be rough and tumble. He was not prepared, however, politically or emotionally, for the savagery and cruelty that was hurled at him. Not one of us could have been. It was 1954. The suicide of Senator Hunt was the final act in a long, miserable, tormented year during which his political opponents used the arrest of his namesake's son, Lester Jr., in a scheme aimed at hounding the senator into resigning from the office to which he had been elected by the people of Wyoming. Young Lester, or Buddy, was arrested in June of 1953 for soliciting homosexual sex from an undercover officer in Lafayette Park across the street from the White House. What you need to know about that is the undercover officer who arrested Buddy was one of 600 members of what the District of Columbia called the Pervert Elimination Squad. And it had been formed at the request of people like Joe McCarthy and Senator Stiles Bridges in order to find and identify homosexuals who worked for the government so that they could be discharged. McCarthy and others had, you recall the claims about communists in the State Department. McCarthy had significant problems providing evidence for that charge. So then he and Bridges talked about homosexuals. And there was this conspiracy theory that was making the rounds in those days that during the war, Adolf Hitler had put together a list of American homosexuals with the goal of eventually blackmailing them into spying for Germany. But when Hitler died, they claimed, that list fell into the hands of Stalin. And this was at the time of the rise of the Cold War. And what McCarthy and others said is that Stalin was now using that list to recruit spies for Russia. Therefore, any homosexual is a security risk and has to be eliminated from the government. And so that's what this squad was formed to do on the night they encountered young Buddy Hunt. Powerful senators, including Stiles Bridges and Herman Welker, who, by the way, had a nickname, was Little Joe from Idaho, because he was so close to Joe McCarthy. McCarthy also was involved. The Senate, as Cale mentioned, the U.S. Senate was divided by one vote. There was one more Democrat than Republican, and the scheme was that if they could force Hunt to resign, that the Republican governor back in Wyoming would appoint a Republican and the control of the Senate would shift. And so these really powerful senators engaged in a lengthy concerted campaign. They cajoled the authorities into reinstating the charges against Buddy after they had been dismissed. Immediately after he was arrested, the U.S. attorney looked at him and saw a young man whom she said is unlikely to reoffend, and he was a seminary student, seemed like a good fellow, and so they dismissed the charges. Bridges and Welker then started a rumor that Hunt had paid a bribe in order to get the charges dismissed, and hold that for the end of the story. Anyway, the charges are reinstated. Buddy goes to trial. His father never gave up on him. Neither did his mother. They found a lawyer to represent him. They sat through the trial every day, at the end of which the court found Buddy guilty, and the judge said, he's guilty of the most heinous crime known to mankind. Somebody should have reminded him of things like rape and murder, but that was the sense of the times. Buddy was sentenced to pay a $100 fine. He then left, as I said, for Cuba, where he taught literacy classes in the mountains. But by this time, Bridges and Welker were launching their campaign. They sent word to Lester Hunt through an intermediary that they planned to force him to resign, and if he didn't, they would make sure everybody in Wyoming knew who his son was. Now, The intermediary was somebody some of you will be familiar with. Anybody remember Red Jacoby? Red Jacoby was the athletic director at the University of Wyoming. Very, very popular. He and Hunt had worked together to build War Memorial Stadium. And Jacoby was a friend of Welker's. Jacoby was from Idaho, where he and Welker, as young kids, had played baseball together. So Welker solicits Red Jacoby to warn Hunt that if he doesn't resign, then bad things were going to come his way. They said they would put a wanted poster. It was a flyer, looked like an Old West wanted poster with Buddy's picture on it, and they would put that in every mailbox in Wyoming. You know, I talked to Buddy. He told me that he blamed himself, and I said, well, I think there are a lot of people who think your father was blackmailed. And his response was, how can you blackmail somebody with information that is in the news, in the public arena? So when I started writing the book, that was in the forefront of my mind. How could they have blackmailed him? And what I found is that the news of Buddy's arrest was not well known. You know, this is 1953. You know, if you out in the countryside, out on the farm or the ranch, if you missed the 6 o'clock news on the radio, you probably didn't hear any news till the next day. Newspapers were all owned, virtually all owned, by one man, Tracy McCracken, who was the Democratic Party powerhouse in Cheyenne, Democratic Party National Committee member, close to Roosevelt and Truman and the national figures. And Tracy made sure it didn't get printed in most of the papers in Wyoming. In my research, I found it in 2 newspapers. One was a Drew Pearson column exposing the blackmail, and the other was a small story in the Torrington newspaper buried on page 13 or 14 under a heading, Washington man found guilty of morals charge. And that was it. So when Buddy thought it was all in the public arena, the truth is that it wasn't. And so this threat to put a flyer in every mailbox in Wyoming was indeed real. That year at Christmas, Mr. and Mrs. Hunt came home to Lander to spend Christmas. And when they got back to Washington, they found that their home had been broken into and ransacked. Virtually nothing of any significance was taken. It was clear that somebody was hoping that they could find some evidence to use against Hunt. I think it's also important background to know of his relationship with Joe McCarthy. In my book, I write about Hunt, and I say people like Joe McCarthy would be unfathomable to a man like Lester Hunt. Lester Hunt was well known for his honesty and his decency, and he first encountered Joe McCarthy in hearings being conducted to determine whether or not American military officers had violated the civil rights of Nazi soldiers who were arrested for massacring American soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge. And Lester Hunt was appointed to a 3-member committee. He's brand new to the Senate. And Joe McCarthy insinuates himself into the committee hearings. And if you read the transcripts, he virtually takes over with accusations that he can't prove and threats unfounded, and eventually he leaves the committee and writes a report exonerating the Nazis and finding the American Army officers at fault in the incident. From that point on, he and Lester Hunt start butting heads. There's a certain amount of humor to the fact that Lester and Mrs. Hunt had a home, and out the back window you could look down below, and there was Joe McCarthy's condominium. And Hunt talked about watching this man cavort with women and drinking booze. He was just not Lester Hunt's kind of guy. And eventually Hunt in public called McCarthy a drunkard and a liar. And as you may know, the members of Congress are immune from slander or libel suits under the Constitution, and so the people that McCarthy would slander had no recourse. And Lester Hunt introduced legislation to change that. So they're butting heads. They are sworn enemies. One day an elevator operator who was a friend of Buddy's told him that he was on the elevator when McCarthy and another colleague were going up, and he overheard a conversation where McCarthy threatened to get Senator Hunt. So this was the tone of things as we go through this year of threats against Senator Hunt. As Cale mentioned, although he originally had planned to run for re-election, by June he had had enough, and he decided that he would not run for re-election. He would not resign from the Senate, but he would not run for re-election. And that was not enough for the people who were out to get him. Resign so that his seat could be replaced by a member of their party. So the next thing that happens is President Eisenhower gets involved and sends an emissary to Hunt and says to him, if you'll resign from the Senate immediately and agree to never run for the Senate again, the president will appoint you to a high-paying job with a 6-year term, and you'll be taken care of. And Hunt's immediate reaction is he wants to do it. He's so sick and tired and worn out by the last year's events that he just wants it all to go away. And he goes home and tells his wife that he plans to take this job, and she says to him, you can't do that. How will the people in Wyoming take that? How will they understand that you resigned under all of this cloud and you got this big paying job and the control of the Senate shifted parties? Now he's between a rock and a hard spot, doesn't know what to do, and then Friday is the incident that Cale talked about with McCarthy. The philosopher Albert Camus writes about suicide, and he said, if you want to know why somebody takes their own life, you need to look at the last encounter they had with a human being before they carried out the act. And that will tell you the reason. And virtually the last encounter that Hunt had was this threat by Joe McCarthy that he was going to conduct hearings to investigate a fellow senator who had given a bribe. That circles back to the unfounded allegation that Hunt had given a bribe to the detectives to get the case dismissed. The next morning, Lester Hunt killed himself. So the lesson for today is more than obvious. These kinds of things, this kind of politics can lead to catastrophic results. It's not neutral. It's not the pull and tug of politics. It goes way beyond that and puts us in an arena that has such serious implications for all of us. And those are the lessons that I'm not sure we've learned. I want to read a part of an essay that I wrote for Democracy Under Construction, which is a League of Women Voters and Wyoming Humanities project. It said, Americans need to know this story, not for the sake of Lester Hunt and his family, but for the realization it carries that the current lack of civility in the public arena is dangerous. Those words were written when this book was published in 2013, and it's only gotten worse. The current lack of civility in the public arena is dangerous, and that it has longer roots than we might think. Joe McCarthy is long time dead and gone, but his heirs are alive and well. So, what do we do? Clearly, we have to find a different way in which to engage one another. I talked at the League of Women Voters session early today, and some of you were there, and I hope you don't mind hearing this a second time. Maybe it's good to hear it twice. But part of the problem is that too many good people have given up engagement in this process. Some out of fear, some out of disgust, some out of a sense of hopelessness. But it's when good people fail to become engaged that these kinds of bad things can thrive. What is community engagement? At a very minimum, in a democratic republic, it means voting. And you may not know that about half of the eligible voters in Wyoming are not even registered to vote. And among the other half, a really surprisingly small number actually vote. And so in some districts, people are elected to the legislature with a 20% turnout in their district. And so it begins, first of all, with a commitment to just doing the fundamental minimum, and that is voting. Community engagement may, for some, mean running for office. For all of us, it means engaging by attending meetings, school board meetings, library board meetings, your party's central committee meetings, county commissioners, city councils, being there and staying until the last item on the agenda has been discussed, letting your voice be heard. And I can tell you, the people, there are people that some of us consider extremists who learned those lessons. They've gone to the meetings. They've volunteered to take jobs and appointments that nobody else wanted, to county central committees, to run for the school board, to be on the planning commission, or a variety of other public areas where too many good people have relinquished that opportunity. And so being engaged means doing those things. At an event like this at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center last April, Al and Pete Simpson came along with Al's spouse Ann, and the community wanted to talk about this very issue. What do we do? And Ann Simpson said it very well. She said, we're in trouble today because most of us didn't go to the meetings, and those of us who went left early because we didn't want to stay late. And the decisions that have changed things in Wyoming political life were made after we left. And she said, we've got to engage, be there, stay there, and take part. Write letters to the editor, contribute to candidates you support, knock on doors, reward courageous public service wherever you find it on either side of the aisle. I quoted my old mentor, Tino Roncalio. Anybody here remember Tino? We had a few. Tino was a remarkable human being. He was in Congress for 10 years. I worked on his staff the last 8 years that he was there. And we could have another evening telling Tino stories. He was really wonderful. But he had a saying that he used often that has stayed with me through my years in public life. He said, good public service is its own reward. You won't find it anywhere else. Our friend Cale Case knows the truth of that. Good public service is its own reward, and you can't expect anything but the reward of knowing that you were there to be of help to your community and engaged in a way that matters. So I want to close with a few words from my book, Profiles in Courage. There has never been another time in the state's history when the winds blew stronger against those who would otherwise act courageously than we witness today. It follows that there has never been a time when recognizing political courage was more important. So if we have time for questions or comments or feedback, I'd be okay. Thank you, Randy. Anybody? Yes, ma'am. He was about 6 months short of a full term. Right. and the irony of it is that with his death, the Republican governor in Wyoming did appoint a Republican, and the control of the Senate shifted for 6 months. 6 months. And Joe O'Mani, who had been in the Senate previously, the interconnections are really a great deal of irony. Joe O'Mani had served for 4 terms in the Senate, and in 1952 ran against a guy named Frank Barrett, who had been governor and member of Congress and board of trustees at the university and attorney general. And Joe McCarthy came to campaign for Senator Barrett and held a rally in Riverton, which is said to be the largest political rally in the state's history. And
It's actually a diversion gap.
that's right.
3,500 people.
Yeah. And many people feel that as a result, Barrett beat O'Mani, and then O'Mani comes back after Lester Hunt is killed and runs for the office in 1954, and he wins what turned out to be his final term. Anyone else? Yes. Sure. The question is about the rate of suicide among Native Americans, and the gentleman said he had heard that it was high on the reservation, and is it still high? And it is, particularly among younger Native peoples. And you know, and it really, it just, all of these examples take you right back to Durkheim's theory. When there's something broken in the culture, suicide rates are high. And that's certainly the case with the Native American population. Yes, sir.
Can't let us leave without a license plate question.
Yes, good.
The Wyoming license plate, there's kind of a controversy of whether Dead Man was the horse with little guy
Barlow, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the research, what you found?
Yeah, the question, thanks. The question is about the Wyoming license plate and the bucking horse on it and the controversy about that. And it's really an interesting controversy because it took up a great deal of Lester Hunt's last term as Secretary of State. He is credited with taking the symbol and putting it on the license plate. He did not create the symbol. But there was a lot of controversy. People thought he was taking credit for creating the symbol. He didn't create it, others did, and there's a huge controversy over who that was. And whether it was, I can't remember the fellow's name, he was a National Guardsman who created it for the National Guard patches on their shoulders, or some other person. And that takes up about 20 pages in the book.
Is that what Randy Weiss addressed it?
Oh, good. Randy?
Well, I'll give you my personal opinion.
Come up against the mic.
So Lester Hunt is quoted, I believe it's the Cheyenne Eagle, saying that Stubb Farlow was the inspiration for the bucking bronc suit. And Stubb Farlow was a Lander, Wyoming cowboy. So I think, and there's a photograph of Stubb on a horse. The horse seems to be the more controversial part of this whole thing, which I can't quite figure why that's important. But I don't know the answer to that, but as far as I'm concerned, from this part of Wyoming here, it's still Farlow on that list.
Yeah.
There you have it.
There we got it. Thanks, Randy. Anyone else? Comment, question? Yes, sir.
Did the three senators that you mentioned experience any consequences of their actions?
I'm glad you asked that question. The answer is no during their lifetime. The Senate, well, that's not entirely right. I think a good argument can be made that Joe McCarthy's demise was hastened by Lester Hunt's suicide. Because Cale gave the timeline. You know, McCarthy had been doing what he did to Hunt to others for a long time. And others had committed suicide as a result of McCarthy's conduct. But this was different. This was one of their own. This was somebody they knew and loved and respected who had been a victim of McCarthy's tactics. And so it's not long after that when McCarthy is censured and McCarthy and goes away, basically. He spent his last several days in severe alcoholism and irrelevant. The other two, Welker was not elected to another term and kind of quietly faded into Idaho, left no papers behind. Senator Bridges eventually went home, and you know, if you're a reader, you enjoy history, you ought to read his biography. It talks about when he died, stashes of tens of thousands of dollars in cash hidden all over his house and at his law office. Nobody ever knew where that had come from. But the good that came out of this book was, first of all, there was justice for Buddy Hunt. But when the manuscript was completed and I sent it to Buddy for his review, a few days later he called me to say thank you, that he had found a great deal of relief in understanding that he was not the cause of his father's suicide, that it was this political machination. The seminary that expelled him, after the dean of the Episcopal Theological School read the book, he called me to get a hold of Buddy, and called Buddy, and the school issued a formal apology to him. And then the third thing is that the biggest newspaper in New Hampshire, the Manchester Union Leader, after this book was published, wrote an editorial saying that they had named countless things after Stiles Bridges, and the newspaper wanted his name removed from all public buildings and property. That didn't happen, but it was unthinkable that a man of such renown in New Hampshire had reached a point where its biggest conservative newspaper had issued that call. So that was kind of the fate of the thing. The one last thing on McCarthy that you ought to know is that he left thousands of or hundreds of boxes of papers, letters, speeches, all that sort of thing, at Marquette University in Wisconsin, under a contract with the university that says they will not allow anybody access to those papers until his daughter dies. Now, you can imagine what's in those papers, that he wants to make sure his daughter has gone on to the next world before they start being made public. Sure. The question is, has anybody done a research about suicide among public servants? Well, I haven't done a study, and I'm not aware of any studies, but at the time I wrote this book, there were 6 senators who had taken their lives while they were in office, and he was the 6th. But I'm not aware of any studies about it. And I'm not aware of circumstances for the other 5. So. Yes. Yes, yes. Oh, it is here? No, it's not. Okay. The question, the comment raises the Kinsey report. Does anybody remember the Kinsey report from the 50s? Um, the relevancy is that Buddy Hunt told me that on the night he was arrested, that he was experimenting with bisexuality. The Kinsey report was published in that same period of time, was a large report of surveys of thousands of Americans studying sexuality. And their conclusion was that 36% of all American males at that time had experimented with bisexuality. And that's what Buddy was doing. And later, as I said, married a woman, had children and grandchildren. He died about 8 years ago in Chicago, but a really remarkable person. Anything else? Yes?
What is your next book about?
My next book. My wife won't let me write another one. She said, you know, it's interesting. I never planned on, it was never a thought in my mind about writing books. And when Buddy suggested that I do this one, that struck me as a worthwhile project. This story had, for the most part, not been told. People didn't know about it. You know, I worked for Tino for 8 years, and Tino knew Hunt very well. The most I ever heard Tino say when I asked him about Lester Hunt was, they treated that man very badly. Mrs. Hunt is largely credited with making sure the story did not get told. She was adamant that her son not be dragged through this again in a time when there was such stigma about homosexuality and about suicide. She didn't want the story told. Many of you, I suspect, are familiar with Dr. Larson, T.A. Larson. Maybe you've read his book, The History of Wyoming, which was the seminal textbook in high school and college for many years among people studying Wyoming history. Dr. Larson knew the story. Hunt had confided with him and with others. And so when he wrote his textbook, he told the story. And he sent a copy of the manuscript to Mrs. Hunt and said, you know, I just want to make sure I have my facts right. Could you tell me what you think? Well, instead of writing him back, she hired a lawyer named Joe Hickey, whom many of you may remember. Joe later became a governor and a U.S. senator and a federal court judge, so pretty esteemed lawyer. And Joe Hickey wrote to Doc Larson and said, if you print that, we will sue you. So if you have that book on your shelf, go to page 521. How many semesters did you ever get to page 521 of the history book you were reading? Well, on page 521, it says, Lester Hunt, overcome by personal and political problems, took his own life. And that's all anybody knew, and most people didn't know that. And so she wanted to keep it that way. And so when I had the opportunity to tell this story, Mrs. Hunt was deceased, and her daughter and son cooperated, wanted the truth told. So I wrote that, and then a couple of other ideas came along, and then one day I looked on my shelf, I saw JFK's Profiles in Courage, and I said, you know, there's a Wyoming book with that title. And so I set out to write. There are 13 stories of people in Wyoming history who have exhibited extraordinary courage, and but hopefully another idea won't come along. I'm about out of time. So.
I do want to mention both books are back here. If you'd like to get a copy before you leave, so just want to plug in for a copy.
Thank you for that. Thank you all for this evening and for your wonderful reception.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you all for coming. I hope we can all remember the lessons here. And I got a different tie on today than I had at the library. This is also my father's tie. And the thing I didn't tell about the story about the funeral procession and the church. For one thing, at the church in Cheyenne at the funeral, Richard M. Nixon was there and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Wow. Nixon was vice president, so he's president of the Senate. Lyndon Johnson had come over to the Senate from the House, and he was, in vying for minority leadership. But also in that church was my father. And my father was an honorary pallbearer. And Mrs. Hunt had asked him to be a pallbearer along with a couple other Lander guys. And by the way, Hunt's house was next door to your grandfather's house, Scott, on 3rd Street across from Trinity Church, right on the alley, the old house with the porch. So Dad was there at that funeral, and Dad was there at that graveside. And I just think how the nation must have been stunned by this. And so much happened, and what it meant. And it did mean the demise of Joe McCarthy. I mean, it did happen. It had started, but that was part of it. But I just think about my father when he's, they buried him on Tuesday after he committed suicide on Monday, and both houses had met the day before and adjourned out of respect. I don't think we could accomplish anything like that today with Facebook and all this. And so I just think of how shocked he must have been. And Dad still owed him money because Hunt had been his silent partner for a long time, helped to revitalize a drugstore that had gone belly up in the 1930s. That's all another story. But I look at that on those days, a light went out for the world, Certainly went out for my father. He kept that flame alive, and that must have meant a lot for him. And I'm just so excited that with Roger and all of you here, you can come back, and we can rekindle that light that we need so badly. And thank you for that. God bless.
Thank you.